In the quiet English countryside of 1887, a 15-year-old girl made a fatal mistake. She showed kindness to the wrong person. What began as a simple act of mercy, bringing medicine to an ill lodger on a June morning, ended in a blood-soaked bedroom and a mother cradling her dying daughter in the farmyard below. This is the story of Florence Poysden, a beloved village girl whose gentle refusal of unwanted affection would cost her everything, and the obsessed young man who couldn't accept the word no. The village of Teynham, nestled between Sittingbourne and Faversham in Kent, England, held a distinguished place in local history. Once part of the medieval archbishops of Canterbury's estates, it became notable during Henry VIII's reign when Richard Harris, the king's fruiter, planted the first cherry trees in its fields, launching one of the village's most enduring industries. By the 19th century, Teynham was defined by its cherry orchards and hop fields stretching across the parish. The hop cultivation had transformed Kent into a supplier for local breweries, while brickmaking provided additional employment. The arrival of the London Railway in the 1850s enabled faster transport of Teynham's hops, cherries, and apples to the capital. Though modest in size, with cottages, farmsteads, and St. Mary's Church at its heart, Teynham was an industrious and well-regarded community tied closely to the land and brewing trade. Dearden Street Farm was one such place growing both cherries and hops. In 1887, the farmhouse was occupied by George Poysden, a bailiff to local landowner William Roker Dixon, a position conferring steady employment and respect in the parish. Living with him were his wife and their 15-year-old daughter, Florence Kate, born in 1872. Florence was a lively and affectionate girl, greatly valued at home and well thought of in the village. George Poysden had taken on a lodger at Dearden Street Farm, a young man named Charles Walter who arrived in 1884 at age 21, working as an agricultural laborer. Initially, he presented himself as respectable and industrious, seeming to fit easily into the household. Yet as time passed, his behavior became less harmless. By 1887, he had formed an unhealthy interest in the Poysden's daughter, who had only just turned 15. She gave him no encouragement and certainly did not return his affections. Her parents became increasingly uneasy about his intentions and did everything possible to discourage any thoughts of familiarity with their daughter. Despite their vigilance, his feelings for Florence only seemed to grow. What might once have been dismissed as a passing fancy deepened into a troubling fixation. 7 On Wednesday, June 8, 1887, Charles Walter remained in bed, claiming illness and complaining about an ailment he'd mentioned for several days. At 7 a.m., he called out for Florence and asked her to bring him medicine. At first she refused, unwilling to enter his room alone. Yet as his calls continued, she relented and reluctantly took up the medicine. As she stepped closer to the bed and handed him the medicine, he suddenly drew out a razor he had concealed beneath the bedclothes. Despite the young girl's struggles, he cut her throat, inflicting a deep and severe wound. Florence, bleeding profusely, threw open the bedroom window. Seeing her mother in the yard below, she called out in a voice strained with fear and pain. Despite her injuries, she summoned her remaining strength to stagger from the room and make her way down the narrow staircase, each step leaving a trail of blood behind her. She met her mother at the bottom of the stairs, and as she went out into the yard, her father rushed toward her, horrified by the sight before him. Seeing the terrible wound, George Poysden clasped his daughter and cried out, "My poor child, you will die." He then hurried off desperately to fetch the doctor. Mrs. Poysden stayed with Florence, but despite her best efforts and care, her daughter succumbed to her injuries and died in her arms about 15 minutes later. Charles Walter, having witnessed the outcome of his attack from his bedroom window, then turned the razor upon himself. The wound, however, proved superficial, failing to penetrate deeply enough to be fatal. Police Constable Gibson soon arrived at the farm, bringing order to the chaotic scene. He moved quickly and decisively, restraining Charles Walter, who was weak and in shock from his self-inflicted wound. Once the young man had been stabilized and treated by a doctor, Constable Gibson escorted him from the farm to Faversham police station where he was placed in custody. The following day, Coroner Mr. Harris held an inquest into Florence Kate Poysden's tragic death. The proceedings revealed horrifying circumstances. The young girl had died from a terrible gash across her throat, so deep it had severed her windpipe. The prisoner arrived at court in a cab, and the streets from the police station were lined with people eager to see him. He was quite short and slightly built, with a fresh complexion, light hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, and rather hollow cheeks. He was dressed well in a dark tweed suit. However, when he saw the mother of his victim, he broke down in tears, taking several minutes to regain his composure. The coroner instructed the jury to inspect the bedroom where the attack occurred. The scene was ghastly. The bed, walls, and floor were covered with blood, a grim reminder of the violence that had taken place. George Poysden's testimony. He recounted how, at Charles Walter's request while ill and confined to bed, Florence had carried medicine upstairs. Minutes later, she looked out the window and screamed for her mother, calling desperately for assistance. He realized shortly after that his daughter's throat had been cut. Mrs. Poysden's testimony, her voice trembling, she told how upon hearing her daughter's desperate cries, she ran from the yard into the house, meeting Florence at the bottom of the stairs. Her daughter was covered in blood, struggling to breathe, clearly clinging to life. Florence managed to tell her that she had given Walter his medicine when he suddenly got out of bed with a razor and slashed her throat. Tears streaming down her face, Mrs. Poysden described lifting Florence and carrying her as far as a granary, desperately seeking help. There she saw her husband, who, after embracing Florence, went to fetch a doctor. Despite her frantic efforts and prayers, Florence's life slowly slipped away, and she died in her arms. Her testimony grew even more harrowing as she recounted what followed. Charles Walter came downstairs, still in his pajamas with a wound across his throat from which there was some blood. He approached her with strange calmness, extending his hand and asking for forgiveness. His words, spoken in a voice both chilling and detached. "Oh, Mrs. Poysden, forgive me and shake hands. You have always been so good to me. I can't think what I did it for." Before she could respond, he went back upstairs and returned minutes later fully dressed. Once again, he repeated his plea for forgiveness and declared that he would be hanged for his crime. Mrs. Poysden added that the day before the murder, Florence and Walter had exchanged words. Florence had told him she did not want him, dallying after her, words that appeared to have angered him. Additional witnesses. Another witness recalled that Charles Walter had taken his razor to be sharpened only the day before the murder, a detail that in retrospect cast a far more sinister meaning on what might otherwise have been an ordinary act. Mrs. Anne-Marie Houghton testified that she arrived at the house just as the girl was dying. Walter had been pacing his room, so she went up and asked why he had done it. He replied, "She had been teasing me and saying she should go out in the afternoon." Dr. Manning's testimony. He stated that he reached the house as soon as possible after being summoned, but Florence had already died. He confirmed death was caused by a cut to her throat inflicted by a razor. When he realized Florence was dead, he attended to Walter's wounds. He said that Walter told him when Florence came to his room, the desire suddenly seized him to kill her. Other witnesses spoke of Walter's conduct during his stay at Dearden Street Farm, testifying that he had long displayed a marked fondness for young Florence, which often gave way to jealousy, particularly when she showed him indifference or spent time in the company of others. Police Constable Gibson's testimony. He testified that he arrested Walter, who in reply to the charge said, "Yes, and I don't know what I did it for." During the inquest, Walter declined to cross-examine any witnesses. When asked by the magistrate if he had anything to say, he replied, "I can't remember doing it, sir, and that is the truth." Then, pointing to Police Constable Gibson, he said, "I only remember this man coming upstairs." The verdict. The jury listened to all testimony and after reviewing the medical evidence alongside the statements of Mr. and Mrs. Poysden and others, returned their verdict. The deceased, Florence Kate Poysden, had died as a direct result of wounds deliberately inflicted upon her by Charles Walter. On that basis, it was declared that Walter must stand charged with the crime of willful murder and would be committed for trial. The funeral. Florence Poysden's funeral took place on Saturday afternoon, drawing a crowd of around 200 people, most of them villagers who had known the Poysden family well. The service was solemn and deeply moving, conducted by Reverend Corbould, the vicar of Teynham. Among the mourners were Florence's friends from Teynham Church Sunday School, who followed the coffin in a slow, mournful procession. Florence had been a devoted pupil there, a regular presence each week, and her gentle nature had made her a favorite with both teachers and classmates alike. Her coffin was adorned with 20 wreaths, each a quiet expression of affection and grief. They came from the vicar and his family, from Mr. F. Honeyball, from the children of the parish, from the schoolmaster Mr. Winterton, and from the superintendent and teachers of the Sunday school. Many others had sent floral tributes, simple gestures of love and sorrow for a girl whose kindness had touched so many in the village. Meanwhile, Charles Walter was taken under guard from Faversham police station to Maidstone prison, where he would await his trial. His transfer drew a large and restless gathering outside as people came to catch a glimpse of the man whose actions had shattered their community. Murmurs of disbelief and horror rippled through the crowd due to the savage nature of the crime, the youth and innocence of the victim, and the dreadful betrayal within a household that had once treated Walter almost as one of their own. On Saturday, July 9, 1887, Charles Walter was brought before the court to face the charge of willful murder. From the outset, however, a question arose that would overshadow the proceedings: the prisoner's mental state. There was uncertainty as to whether he was fit to stand trial, and the court moved cautiously to resolve this critical matter. To address the concern, evidence was presented from Dr. Francis Davies, the superintendent of the Barming Heath Asylum. Dr. Davies testified that he had examined the defendant the previous week, and in his opinion, Walter was not in a fit state to comprehend the charge laid against him. The doctor noted that Walter's understanding of his surroundings and the court proceedings was hazy at best, revealing a mind struggling to grasp even the most basic elements of his situation. Dr. Davies also drew attention to a troubling family history. An uncle of Walter's was at that same time confined to the Barming Asylum, pointing to the possibility of a hereditary predisposition to mental disorder. Based on his professional assessment, the doctor concluded with certainty that the defendant, Charles Walter, was affected by such a disorder and as a result was incapable of entering a plea or participating meaningfully in his trial. The outcome. Following this assessment, the judge instructed the jury to find the defendant, Charles Walter, not fit to plead. As a result, the case did not proceed to the ordinary trial for murder. Instead, the judge ordered that the defendant be committed to an asylum during Her Majesty's pleasure, a legal phrase denoting indefinite confinement under the authority of the Crown with no set date for release. In this way, the trial that had been anticipated by the community came to an abrupt and unusual conclusion. There was no public verdict of guilt in the ordinary sense, no judicial reckoning in a crowded courtroom.